Hey, welcome everybody. My name is Stephen McCracken to uh, Tresnatira, and today it's been organised by Reclaim the Enlightenment and Limavady Area Ancestry. Now, today we're having a man called Francis Kane with us today. He's an academic from Belfast. He spent most of the start of this century in China studying. He was one of the founder members of staff of the Irish Institute of Chinese Studies at UCD and has continued to the establishment of two Confucius Institutes, UCD and Ulster University on this island here. So without further ado, I'll just hand you over to Francis here.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. So the title of the talk is perhaps a little bit confusing: the Enlightenment China and the Irish ambassadors of 1793. I'm pointedly calling Lord McCartney and his sidekick, George Staunton, Irish, because in fact they were Irish, fully Irish. And the embassy took place in the year 1792. It set off, it arrived 1793. At that time, Ireland was not part of the United Kingdom. The Kingdom of Ireland was ruled by King George. Ireland had a parliament made up mostly of the landowning class, and this was the tail end of the 18th century in Ireland, a very fervent time, and a time which really interests this group a lot, because it saw several big things develop, which really we live with the effects of them today. I mean, one thing to point out relevant to this talk tonight is the Ireland of 1793. Indeed, even perhaps to a certain extent, the England of 1793, these were still sectarian places, places riven by religious differences and centuries of conflict in Europe. Europe was undergoing an enlightenment, but really things were still pretty bad. The sectarianism in Ireland, I suppose one thing we could say is at that time it wasn't an anachronistic thing. It wasn't unusual the way it may be seen today. Okay, so what are we looking at? We're looking at a satirical sketch put together by a man called James Gilray, a satirist in London, in 1792. This was before the embassy set off. It was ridiculed. Lord McCartney is presented obsequiously, offering all these trinkets and gadgets to the smoking, rotund Chinese emperor. If you care to look at the objects in the picture, they're all slightly comical. The hot air balloon, which if you follow the line, it's directly coming out of McCartney's mouth, indicating this is a ludicrous hot air occasion. I guess before I move on the subject of hot air balloons, yes, the hot air balloon would be one of the examples of an unnecessary thing to bring to China to show off, because the Chinese invented hot air balloons 1,000 years earlier. So we will be hearing more of that type of thing, the way I would put it would be the kind of queer gunk you get when you think you are the boss of the situation. You think you have all the expertise and knowledge, but the people you're trying to show off to are completely nonplussed by your display, and for good reason. So we'll be finding out a bit more why the Chinese were so nonplussed by the British Embassy in 1793. And we'll also be hearing some more about the Irish characters involved. But I must admit, the talk that I have planned in front of us tonight is going to go all over the place a little bit. I think if we're going to talk about these things, I think we need to put them in the context of today, in the context of Chinese relations with the Western world today, because the history of the West and its relationship with China is something perhaps the West is not particularly aware of, whereas in China, you know, everybody in China knows the history of China's relationship with the West. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of all of that, and I hope it'll be pleasant, you know, just to find out about these things. And if you already know about these things, well, I look forward to any comment you want to make or question you might want to ask me at the end. So here we have these guys presented as inept and blundering and childish and silly. And this was before they even left. Okay. This is the man they went to meet. By all means, read that quotation. He wrote this at the time of the embassy. In the picture, he's pictured on the left as a Manchu warrior, in the middle as a kind of a Confucian Chinese emperor, and on the right as a Tibetan philosopher prince. So you can see straight away that the way the Chinese emperor presents himself, you know, is curious. You know, it's evidently not a single entity or even indeed a single religion. So there's something going on in China in the 18th century, which is different to Europe. Okay, there's nothing wrong with bringing little presents, he said. Let's find out a little bit more about what he said. After the mission to Peking by McCartney, the Chinese emperor sent King George III, who, you know, famously as a human being, you know, wasn't very well. He wasn't really himself, poor George. But in terms of one state communicating with another, this is what he said to the king. I won't read it all. You can read it yourself, I hope. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious. I have no use for your country's manufactures. This then is my answer to your request to appoint a representative at my court, a request contrary to our dynastic usage, which would only result in inconvenience for yourself, very Chinese style. Basically, very polite, very cultured, but absolutely a dismissal. Okay, right, let's listen to this chap. This is the current Chinese ambassador to the UK. I hope you're able to hear his words. I've given him some subtitles just in case he's not loud enough. Have a listen. He was speaking on the Andrew Marr show last summer. He had been invited, I think, to talk about the Huawei crisis. You know, the British government had first contracted Huawei in a big way to implement 5G in the UK, and then a few months later, following action by the American government, the British government cancelled the Huawei contract. And this was Chinese manufacturers, this was Chinese technology. So here is Chinese ambassador. Here is what he said to Andrew Marr. Oh, God. All right, sorry, we appear to have a blunder. Silly old Francis. Let's get back to Liu Xiaoming. Sorry. Okay, I hope you caught that. What's fairly chilling about what the ambassador is saying is, I don't know what will happen over the next 150 years. History is a cycle. This is a kind of a mirror image of 1793, but this time it's the British who are refusing the Enlightenment technology. And look what happened to China when it refused the Enlightened technology. China entered a long period of disaster. So, you know, understand what this man is saying, and he's a representative of the People's Republic of China in the UK. He's basically telling the UK it's sunk and its future is well, let's find out what happened to China, and then you can judge for yourself whether he is being friendly to the UK or not. By the way, my focus today has to really be on America and the UK's relationship with China in modern terms. I can't, I'm very interested in Ireland's relationship with China, but it's an entirely different kind of story. This is big stuff. This is a huge philosophical, moral, and political clash going on in the world. Okay, sorry, I need to move it along. Next slide, please. Okay, so the themes I'm going to address. I want to begin with talking about the current plunge in relations between China and the West. I think this will help contextualize everything else I'm talking about. Then very briefly, for obvious reasons, I'm going to take a look at how Europe remembers the Enlightenment and what we mean when we're talking about human rights. This will inevitably involve the Enlightenment discussion around ethics, morality, and where these ideas come from and what the logic of them is. Of course, I'll also be getting to George McCartney and George Staunton, the two strange Irishmen, where interesting thing about these guys is I think they were two of the very early champions of Britishness. Britishness as an idea, you know, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish people being part of the Britishness of the world. And then if we have time, you're very welcome to question me, challenge me about all of this. In the picture, there is an old Chinese illustration of Mozi, or Modi, as he's sometimes called. Modi lived 470 BC to 391. And he was the contemporary and also the alternative to Confucius. We'll be finding out more about him later. But for example, one of the things Mozi believed in was that human beings should love each other and should love each other unconditionally and should be equally loving towards people you don't know as well as people you do know. And he saw this as a means to creating a stable, harmonious state and society. We'll come back to him later. Okay, now the current plunge in relations between China and the West. Illustration shows the Western powers and Japan back toward the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when China was basically carved up. 2017, a mere 4 years ago, Theresa May quoted golden era of bilateral relations, particularly regarding trade, particularly regarding economic relations. So it's all looking good, I suppose, 4 years ago for people who move in those circles. But things started to go very badly wrong when a man called Gavin Williamson became the Defence Secretary of the UK. Very quickly, he announced that a warship, not a warship, a carrier, the HMS Elizabeth, no less, the pride of the British Navy. At the time, the ship wasn't actually even in commission, but for some insane reason, he chose to threaten China. He specifically said the UK will not hesitate to use lethal force against those who break international law in the South China Sea. So it was a really incredible thing to say. What made it worse was he said this a few days before the British Chancellor was due to visit China on a big trade mission. Interestingly, just like McCartney, Philip Hammond was going to go to China with 90 business people and academics, and there was going to be this huge, vitally important trade mission to China in 2019 from the UK. Well, it didn't happen because of Williamson's speech. The Chinese government immediately responded in the strongest terms. Gavin Williamson didn't last long as the Defence Secretary, and I don't know if you were aware of this at the time. Certainly, it wasn't treated as a major story at the time, and that's typical. Relations with China are occasionally referred to in the media, and generally speaking, they're still not considered, somehow to be as important as in fact they really are. There's the issue of Hong Kong. Again, things went. Things have been bad in Hong Kong for several years now. The yellow umbrella movement is basically a movement for democracy, and with it, the more westernized ideas of human rights, free press, rule of law, and so on. What I've pictured there are some Chinese protesters in London protesting against the other Chinese protesters in London who are protesting against the Chinese government. What makes this really insulting and impossible to tolerate, I suppose, for the Chinese is that, as you can see, British and American flags get waved. A British national overseas passport gets championed, and China becomes furious because it sees it as a matter of sovereignty. And I suppose you could follow their argument that if similar interference were to occur the other way around, it would be hard to swallow by the authorities. But in terms of Hong Kong, obviously the British controlled Hong Kong for a long time. British gained Hong Kong through the First Opium War. The origins of Hong Kong are not glorious or edifying. They are pretty grim. But all of that said, a unique society developed in Hong Kong with unique features, unique political freedoms. Again, having said that, democracy democracy was granted to Hong Kong in 1996, 1 year before it was handed back to China. So, I don't mean to make any cheap shots. I certainly don't want to defend the indefensible or support the insupportable, but the whole issue over Hong Kong is very, very complicated. And it's made more complicated because the agreement has now been trashed. The British claimed that the Chinese had broken the Hong Kong Agreement of 1997, and then the British themselves broke it. Just to inform the conversation, the treaty signed with China over Hong Kong was broken by the UK last year. The UK broke it by offering the British National Overseas Passport safe haven to the UK. That directly went against the terms of the agreement. The Chinese responded by refusing to recognise the British National Overseas Passport anymore. And so what this means is that whole agreement between the UK and China over Hong Kong is finished. It's dead in the water. It's been broken by both parties. So the future of Hong Kong is Well, I was going to say it's in doubt. Actually, I would say it's in no doubt now that Hong Kong will become increasingly more like the rest of China. Xinjiang, the far west, largely Muslim province where the Uyghur people live. In the picture, you can see lots of lovely Uyghur people. People in Chinese cities are familiar with Uyghur people, large Uyghur minorities in many Chinese cities. No blatant or overt signs of conflict, but obviously there has been conflict. I'll just tell you a quick personal story. I arrived in China for the first time in February 2001. To my huge surprise, I think it was my third day there. I've been there just a couple of days, 2 or 3 days. And I was walking through the streets of a big new city called Shenzhen. And I heard the all too familiar sound of an explosion. It was a sound I recognized. It was a bomb. And I thought, oh, that sounds like a bomb. And sure enough, it was a bomb. It was a Xinjiang separatist Uyghur bomb, which had been planted at a supermarket in Shenzhen. Thankfully, no one was hurt. It was a fairly small device. But this was not at all what I expected to find in China. And so over the last 20, 25 years in China, there has been a political crisis with violent resistance and at times lethal violence from Uyghur separatists in China. So the Chinese government sees it as a terrorism problem and unsurprisingly has dealt with its terrorism problem in the way that you might expect it to. Detention without trial, internment, and also this big push to re-educate, which is a highly controversial phrase, I know. Please appreciate, I'm not defending the indefensible. I merely want to show you the other perspective. Here is an example of the Chinese government voice. This is Chinese government discourse translated. This is a report in the Global Times, which is a Chinese government mouthpiece. So very briefly, if you just look there at the bottom, Jen also said that from 2010 to 2018, the Uyghur population of Xinjiang grew by 2.5 million people, or 25%, which is higher than Xinjiang's overall population growth rate, ethnic minority population growth rate, and Han population growth rate. Why are these figures being quoted? Well, it's because they have been accused of genocide. So they are pointing out that the Uyghur minority is actually growing faster than any other group in that part of China. Okay, I don't want to take up all the time on these relations, but basically they are disastrous. Let's talk about human rights. Here's the Chinese government talking about human rights. The Canadian government implemented cultural extermination against Indigenous population in the 1970s. The American government, through its Western movement, expelled and killed large numbers of native people. The wars in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan have not gone on unnoticed. Then she turned her fire on the Australians and their white Australia policy. So just let's not forget that when China is criticized over human rights, they have the option to criticize the West over human rights, and they frequently take that option. Okay. This is just more about Xinjiang. Basically, Cambodia supports China, and the Turkish Patriotic Party supports China. Interesting that there's so much support in Turkey, given that Turkey is a NATO country and also a largely Muslim country. So, so there's a game being played here. Another kind of great game is being played, and it's to do with Muslim extremism and containing it. I've got lots of discourse here from the Chinese government about human rights, but I'm looking at the time and thinking I'll press on. Chinese alliances around the world are increasing. Chinese quite dependent relationships on China are developing all around the developing world. China is investing heavily in the developing world, but not really in a compassionate kind of way. It's really to do with economic growth. This is the pandemic, another human rights issue that the Chinese point out. Chinese discourse very quick to point out that the death rate from COVID-19 is highest in the UK and America, and amongst the lowest in China. By the way, they completely reject that the virus came from Wuhan. They, in an Enlightenment way, they say the facts are not clear, and until the facts are established, it would be best not to blame China for the pandemic. As you may know, China is geographically surrounded by American and American military air bases. So you take a quick look there. As you can see, the way that the Chinese Navy can get out from its own country is around Taiwan and also through the South China Sea. America is 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 miles away from China. China's an advanced country. It's got a space station, it's got satellites, it's got astronauts. It's got nuclear weapons. It's a superpower. I'm going to shoot through this history because I think it's important. 1954, there was a crisis with Taiwan. America threatened China with a nuclear bomb. This is after the foundation of the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights. I'll just say that again. The United States threatened a nuclear attack on China in 1955. 1959, there was the uprising in Tibet, which I'm sure you've heard about. Yes, the CIA funded that, uprising. So my point being that it was political. It was political interference. But yes, human rights abuses, of course. China got the bomb in 1964. 1989, I'll never forget it. Tiananmen Square. Interestingly, just to relate to some of Guy Biner's ideas about forgetting and disremembering. Yes, in the spring of 1989, there was almost a revolution in China. It wasn't just a few hundred students in Tiananmen Square. There was a huge movement right across the country. Most citizens in Beijing supported the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. As you know, Tiananmen Square was completely crushed and things turned completely differently. Again, just to get it all in context, Taiwan became a democracy in 1996, something which threatened China and annoyed China a lot. A different political system emerged and also more of a Taiwanese identity. May 1999, NATO bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing Chinese people. Direct military attack on the Chinese embassy. Didn't result in World War III. I would suggest if it happened today, it would definitely result in World War III. Clinton linked most favored nation to human rights, and then he dropped it. So China basically got into the World Trade Organization and the big trading system of the planet without needing to do anything about human rights or democracy or any such things. China has been developing fast. In the last 12, 15 years or so, military spending in China is rocketing, and China now rivals America for military hardware, which is ironic because China is also America's largest financial creditor. I think the current figure is something, it's in the trillions, you know, the debt that America owes China. I'll just say that again. America owes China a massive debt, which is ironic because at the time of the Boxer Rebellion, China owed, you know, the imperial powers a huge debt. I wanted to go through all the racism, dehumanization, and planning of the Chinese in America, but I don't have time. But basically, the history of Chinese human rights in America is very, very poor. The Americans legislated directly against the Chinese for nearly 100 years. Just directly racist, directly directed specifically at the Chinese. Here's some interesting images from New York in the 1870s. This was when Uncle Sam was not happy with the Irish or the Chinese. Irish and the Chinese built the railroad, which led to America becoming an economic superpower. But at that time, I suppose, nativist, that's the wrong word, but American nationalists didn't like the Irish or the Chinese. There was a trend for Chinese men to marry Irish women at that time, generally because Irish men didn't last very long, and there was an imbalance of the sexes, and this was a way for Irish girls to have a family. Okay, I can't go anymore. I need to go. I need to get on to the Enlightenment fast. Okay, the Enlightenment. So Europe remembers the Enlightenment basically as the age of reason. So it kicks off at the end of the Renaissance with Leonardo and Galileo, these polymathic individuals who are basically trying to form a coherent system of human knowledge, not seeing any great difference between a scientific discovery or a moral one, philosophical one. These guys are rightly remembered as extraordinary thinkers, scientists, and polymaths. So we think of the Enlightenment as Europe turning away from magic and spells and superstitions and and if you like, the huge, overweening and irrational Catholic Church. The Reformation had a big role in kickstarting the European Enlightenment, because once people could question the Catholic Church, then they could start to question everything else too. But I would argue that the cost for many Protestant thinkers was that their very faith in God was shaken. Looking for, the answer, looking for an answer to what the world should be like, what a country should be like, what is good, and so on. I just want to mention this chap. This is Nicolo Machiavelli. There's nothing more important than appearing to be religious. Rulers should uphold the basic principles of the religion they practice, even though they be convinced it is fallacious. I think pretty obviously we have, the father of political theory here, Nicolo Machiavelli, the father of Western political thought. There's no God in here. There isn't even really any real ethics here. But there is something about, how to run a state, how to keep order, I suppose. Okay, I turn now to the Chinese philosophers. I guess this is an important part of my talk. I'll be dealing with Confucius a bit. The main point about Confucius is it's not a belief in God, it's a belief in order, respect. There isn't a God that you can pray to. The mandate of heaven applies to the people and the ruler. And really, it's largely about keeping to rituals and respecting the family, and also the hierarchy of society. The interesting thing, of course, about Confucianism is the meritocracy. So the civil service in China for centuries was decided by exam. The aristocracy were reduced and sometimes completely dismissed from importance. So throughout Chinese history, you have this, the state is being run by Confucian scholars, experts in Confucian scholarship. Sima Qian was lived around the 1st century. Sima Qian was a historian, a very good historian, a rival of Suetonius or Tacitus or any European historian would have to doff their cap to Sima Qian. Sima Qian would use different sources and would question the truth of sources and so on. Again, I'm running out of time. So basically, the other figures here are Yingling, a great 20th century Chinese feminist, Wang Huning and He Jiahong. These guys are still alive, and they would be the somewhat shadowy philosophes who stand behind the Chinese government. So in a way that's interesting. The Chinese government still has its tradition of paying heed to very scholarly people with very big ideas about the state. Okay. Mozi. The difference between Mozi and Confucius is Confucius wants you to respect your family and obey the hierarchy, and Confucius is very much, I suppose, leaning towards the upper classes, sort of wealthier people. Mozi was more working class. Mozi was a carpenter, interestingly enough, who believed in universal love. He was a contemporary of Confucius. Mozi's ideas actually were dominant for a while, but eventually fell out of favor and weren't actually part of the Chinese philosophical mainstream, but never forgotten. Mozi never forgotten what he espoused. And, you know, we have our sort of left wing, right wing. Confucianism has this kind of hierarchy and family, universal love kind of dynamic. Munzi or Mencius, again, I mentioned this to a good friend of ours, Philip Orr, expert on Francis Hutchinson. Many of Hutchinson's beliefs really sound a bit like Mencius. Basically to do with people being good and people tapping into their goodness, and that beauty and goodness are detectable, you know, that they are real things that are part of the natural order of the universe, you know. Here's Hutchinson. So he argued that humans have natural and disinterested feelings of benevolence. So what I'm saying is not that Francis Hutchinson got these ideas from you know, a prehistoric Chinese philosopher. What I'm saying is the Chinese philosophers' ideas and the Ulster Scot philosophers' ideas really, they would have got along very well and would have understood each other very well, I think. Okay, here are some European people. The reason I've mentioned these guys, Montesquieu there, and Leibniz, Bale. It's Bale on the left, Leibniz in the middle, and Montesquieu on the right. The reason they're getting mentioned is they specifically referred to China quite a lot in their writings. So they actually, well, to give you a summary, Bale thought China was a kind of a tolerant, atheistic monarchy. Leibniz thought that it was an exemplar of human and divine justice. And de Montesquieu later on, and this is significant, Europeans were thinking of China as an exceptional place, but also a corrupt and despotic place. So you can see how the European Enlightenment, in a way, picked up China as a way to criticize Europe. But as it progressed, then started criticizing China back. Good old Voltaire. Voltaire referred to China a great deal, hundreds of times in his writing. He had never been to China. I didn't necessarily know that much about China, but again, he didn't like the French aristocracy. He didn't like the sort of pointlessness of religious sectarianism. He was using a kind of an idea of China really to criticize France. Slavery. I want to talk about slavery because in a way it's a good example of you know, the difference between Enlightenment talk and Enlightenment action. Plenty of Enlightenment talk, plenty of great thinkers who were racists and slave owners. So let's think more about big actual change. So slavery being abolished, this is a map that shows when slavery was abolished in different parts of the world. You'll notice that in China, it was the year 1910. Yeah, I wanted to talk briefly about the song outrage, but I have no time. Emperor, contemporary of Jesus Christ, abolished slavery in AD 9. He was responding to neo-Confucian ideas. He was a very scholarly emperor, but very idealistic. And you know, there's a kind of a theme in this, a very idealistic, very scholarly, polymathic, intelligent emperor descended into violence, chaos, and cruelty, and re-established slavery a mere 3 years later. But it is interesting to note that slavery was abolished 2,000 years ago in China, only to be re-established very quickly. Marco Polo talking about Kublai Khan, pointing out Kublai Khan's religious tolerance, I guess. The first Europeans to spend a lot of time in China were the Jesuits. This is Matteo Ricci with Xu Guangqi. Xu Guangqi did convert to Christianity, but the main point was the shared scholarship. There was a period in the late 16th through the 17th century when the Jesuits in China got along very well in the Chinese court, mostly because of science, I have to say, rather than morality. Here's a brilliant product of that period. This is a combination of Jesuit and Chinese brilliance. It's one of the first ever maps of the world that's accurate. This is a genuine thing. This is not a fakery thing or anything. This is a real map from early 17th century. And you can see China's in the middle. The map was made by Jesuits and Chinese. More on religious tolerance. There's Confucius presenting Buddha to Lao Tzu. So here you have Buddhism, Taoism, two great religious traditions in China, and Confucius. Interesting that, you know, Confucius is the dominant figure here. So there's a tolerance of religion, but there's a kind of a superior idea of Confucianism in Chinese history. Modern China is a place where religion is persecuted. Just thought I'd make that point. Voltaire. Oh, I'm not going to have time to talk about McCartney. Anyway, I just wanted to...
Take as long as you need, Francis.
Okay, let's get on to McCartney now. This is Voltaire. I showed you Voltaire earlier and his wonderful references to how great China was, what a great rational, enlightened state China was compared to France. But this quote from Voltaire is actually about McCartney. A curious thing about McCartney and Staunton is they both spent time in France. And McCartney actually met Voltaire. As a young man, McCartney was allegedly very handsome, with a photographic memory and you know, a lot of charm. Very interesting that McCartney spent time in France before the revolution. This, of course, meant that he was a slightly suspicious character to the English. You have this big Ulster Scot, educated in Trinity. At least as a young man, he was very imposing, and he ends up becoming one of the builders of this new thing, the British Empire. He goes to the Caribbean. He goes to Moscow, where he's sent as the British emissary to Moscow because he's young and handsome. And Catherine the Great, the female ruler of Moscow, was supposed to take a shine to McCartney. And so this guy, McCartney, was able to impress Voltaire. A little bit of information about them. So was George McCartney Irish? Yes, he was. He was a descendant from the McCarthys of Cork. A member of the McCarthy clan, escaped to Scotland in the late Middle Ages, ended up developing there in Scotland, and then they became planters. So, that's an interesting story of McCartney's Gaelic origins. Staunton, more a case of English planter family, but very, absolutely Irish himself. These guys were, in a way, I would argue, the first truly kind of British people, as opposed to representatives of England or whatever. So, when McCartney was getting besieged in Granada by the French, he was the British viceroy, he was the British governor. When he went to Peking, he was the British ambassador. Same everywhere he went. He was a representative of Britain. And let's understand, 18th century Britain is ruling the waves, or nearly ruling the waves. And there are these ships full of these men from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, different parts of the king's realms. So the thesis goes that Britishness was formed on those empire-building trips, when these people from the British Isles would be kind of forced together, and then together what they would do, of course, is otherize everybody else. And by otherizing everybody else, they created this new idea of Britishness. And it was, in Enlightenment terms, Britishness was all about trade and economics. It wasn't about rights and freedoms, despite the fact that the British had a Bill of Rights, and to a certain extent, compared with other countries, British human rights were comparably better with a lot of other places. And Britain had even, or England had even had a republic with the famous Oliver Cromwell. So the English and the British story of the Enlightenment, it's a pity I don't have any more time, but it would be fair to say that Britain and notably Scotland and Ireland made very significant contribution, not just to the Enlightenment, but also to Britishness. Okay. When he got to China, there was his trip. These are very long distances. The overland trip was the return journey. Really, that's a huge overland trip. That's thousands of miles all the way through China. I wish I could give you the whole story, but I'm sure you're wanting to go off and do your own thing. So I'll just share a few nice pictures. There are the gifts that were handed over. McCartney and Staunton were very keen to promote the Irish economy in China. And so one of the gifts that the Chinese emperor got was, Audrey, thank you for your question, Audrey. Great question.
Here's me asking it.
Okay. Now again, my view about McCartney would be that he was actually, very proud of his king and his rapid rise, but he was very self-interested. He wouldn't go to China without getting a peerage and 10,000 a year salary. He was deeply involved with the East India Company and Henry Dundas. Henry Dundas was a big Scottish politician of the 18th century. He was the Home Secretary, he was an ally of Pitt. So, the active union with Scotland, Scotland was becoming British. McCartney's patrons were mostly Scottish, particularly this guy Dundas. So I think actually it was Dundas who put it into McCartney's head, this Britishness thing, because Ireland was moving towards the Union. It was moving towards a Republican revolution, which failed, and the Union came swiftly in its wake. And people like Staunton and McCartney would have been for that. They would have been positive for that. It's a really good question, Audrey. Obviously, I can't answer accurately because I don't know the man's personal motivations, but I can say from the facts, it looks like he acknowledged his Scottishness more than his Irishness. Other people acknowledged his Irishness. Again, when we talk about Irishness, 18th century Irishness was something different. It was an identity that actually no longer exists. So it was an Irishness within the context of King George and loyalty to King George. Okay, I think I will promise you just another couple of minutes and not keep everyone ridiculously long. I'll just make a few final comments. The final comment would be, after the failure of this mission to China, really the Enlightenment idea of China vanished. And very quickly, intent was set upon exploiting China economically. At that time, India didn't have tea. China had tea. The British were busy conquering India, so they took tea from China, planted it in India, and then sold it all around the world, whilst also selling opium to the Chinese. To cut a long story short, the gifts that the Chinese emperor gave ended up in the Brighton Pavilion, in the Royal Pavilion, some of them. Most of them just got sold off very cheaply. The gifts that McCartney gave the Chinese emperor were actually an embarrassment because none of them were really anything new to him. So they were put in the Chinese Yuan Ming Yuan, which the Europeans destroyed about 80 years later. So to conclude, I would say McCartney and Staunton are well worth investigating. Very interesting characters for numerous reasons. The Enlightenment itself it's not any one thing. It exists on a scientific plane, on an artistic plane, and also of interest to us on an ethical and political plane. And on that ethical and political plane, I have to say the Europeans and the Chinese were not so different in the actual ideas that they developed. They just developed them at different times. Okay.
A wee question I have, Francis. Why were they sent to China?
Oh, very much to set up an embassy there and open up more trade. So the Chinese government only allowed trade in the extreme south through Canton at that time. So Europeans needed the Chinese market to develop their economies. So he was very specifically sent there to open up trade.
Okay. Yeah. And how big was China back then? You were telling us earlier about the different factions there, and maybe it was a bit like Germany. It was all fractured and then it all joined together. Was that the same, or was it already?
Well, at times in Chinese history, yeah, it fractured, and that's the interesting point. When China fractured, that's when you would get the philosophers coming out to explain how to bring it all back together again. Yeah, China had several periods in its history of chaos and warring states, but fairly consistently over a period of some 3,000 years, it was dynastic empires, and not just separate dynastic empires that recognized each other and were related to each other culturally. So a very, very deep civilization, a very long civilization. And that's why today the Chinese are so proud of China and Chineseness. It's really hurtful to the Chinese to have their civilization insulted, because it's really, it's just the fact that China is the product of a very long, ancient civilization that never really disappeared.
Okay. Was McCartney first choice to send out, or was he down the pecking order? You get this wee man, or this Ulster Scots running around the country going mad. Where are we going to send this boy to?
Oh, that's a great question. I think he was actually number one choice, because I think actually he was a very talented man. I think he was. I think he's been hard done by history. Fair enough, he made his choices in life, but the things he did were extraordinary. And he, there's a story of him having a duel in England, Stephen, in the 1780s. So he's come back from his empire building in the Caribbean, and he's got into some row with some English aristocrat from the House of Lords. McCartney isn't a lord yet, and they have this duel, and McCartney seriously injured in the duel, nearly lost his life. But all that 18th century stuff, having duels and being a gentleman. So I think McCartney was an extraordinary figure, and he was the number one choice.
Yeah. There's good questions coming here from Dan Sands, and just to get down the knuckle of it, how is he remembered in China today and in Ulster? Is he well known,
In China, yes. As I said earlier, yes, the Chinese don't forget. So the Chinese remember him, but they remember him as the British ambassador. They don't remember any connection with Ireland, and they remember him as bad news. That was a bad event, because McCartney was very hostile to China. McCartney was really looking to see if the British could take China. He was
okay.
He wasn't. He wasn't enlightened morally himself. He was a powerful political figure. Would the McCartney delegation have researched the culture, philosophy, and language? Yes, Catherine. they employed Jesuits from Rome to teach them, but it all failed. The only member of the party who learned any Chinese was the boy, the son of Staunton, who later became one of the greatest Western scholars of China in the 19th century. Yeah, but there was an 11-year-old boy who was able to speak Chinese, learning it off the Jesuits on the ship. When the ship landed in Canton, the Jesuits deserted because they were frightened, because the Chinese actually said teaching Chinese to foreigners was punishable by death. So, good question. That's the answer. Any more questions that
Seamus Duffy has a very good one there, and he wonders why Britain didn't try to conquer China.
Oh, Britain did.
The Opium Wars, wasn't it?
Britain effectively did conquer China in combination with the French, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Americans. Is the present regime popular? Ooh, Peter, that would be an ecumenical question. Yeah, to quote Father Ted. I think Chinese nationalism is very strong. Chinese patriotism is very strong. The regular average Chinese citizen, very, very proud of their country and their identity and their history. Whether that is specifically a kind of a popular regime or not, I wouldn't like to say. I think there can always be people like that.
I suppose you were going on about handing over the likes of trinkets and stuff, gifts and all the rest. If anybody ever goes to Belfast City Hall and goes into the mayor's office, you'll see a lot of different items that were given over, embassies give hand over. And a couple of lovely ones are from China in, I think it was 1901, after the Boxer Rebellion, I think. The Chinese embassy representatives came to Belfast and their brand. If you ever go to Belfast City Hall, try and get up and see them. Fantastic looking things.
Yes, well, there was a big Belfast man, Hart, the man Hart from Belfast actually worked in the Qing dynasty court in the second half of the 19th century. The links between Belfast and late 19th century China are very, very deep through this guy Hart. There's a whole other story there to tell. But yeah, surprisingly, Ulsterman was probably the most well-known foreigner in China for a long time. During the kind of humiliating 19th century period when Western powers and Japan were just increasingly taking the place for themselves, and yeah.
Get on. We've got a question here from Liam. Maybe you can see it. Many people who do business in China these days need local support to understand the cultural differences. Yes, this is understood now. How was it understood well in the past?
Okay. So the setup that McCartney was trying to change was the canton system, where the foreigners would actually be separated off into their own areas, and specifically appointed merchants would go in and trade with them. So the original way of doing business in China was really difficult and really kind of limited. These days, I think, well, to be honest, this is the modern world. This is the 21st century. And although I've seen the gift-giving, very kind of formal, culturally controlled exchanges go on in business, I have to say that business, 21st century business has this culture of its own. they, yeah, I mean, there is a need to be polite and nice to people, but equally they understand the need to get down to business, just as the Western person does. So in a way, there's an agreed culture there, third culture that kind of gets set up between the two parties. In my experience, Chinese people generally, Chinese culture is generally very tolerant and welcoming and accepting, and not terribly judgmental or demanding of the stranger. Whatever the private opinions are, the display of hospitality and just simple genteel politeness. This is very normal and natural for most Chinese people, in my experience.
And I suppose you had experience before COVID and before the Huawei issue and all the rest. Do you think that's now changed?
Yes.
Yeah, since Trump's come in and sort of belittled them a bit more.
No, I think the situation is really terribly dangerous. I think Huawei, the pandemic, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, what else do we talk about? Conflict in space, for goodness sake. The dark fear, I suppose, that everybody would have would be regarding Taiwan.
Okay.
What's happening here is not something the Chinese hide or pretend. They're pretty open about it. They're going to take Taiwan back one way or another. And they have almost religious kind of dogmatic one China policy view about that. And with relations deteriorating so badly between the West and China, it raises the opportunity for China to take Taiwan and not start World War III as a result. So I don't mean to be a kind of a fearmonger, because actually,
Suppose it's staring us all in the face, really, isn't it?
Yeah, there is a big game going on between superpowers, which is nothing to do with ordinary people and the way we relate to each other. It's a very serious, very big game. The current Chinese regime, the Chinese Communist Party, are ideologically wedded to the one China policy, and therefore it's risky and dangerous when relations are so poor.
Yeah, I think that's really it for now. Thank you very much for coming on Trasnatira, and thank you to Weekend Enlightenment for organising it tonight. Is there a couple more questions there, maybe? Okay. No, it's just about Taiwan again. Nope, that's okay. Well, here, thank you, Francis. It's very good of you, and from Trasnatira, thank you very much. Okay, thank you everybody for tuning in tonight, and we'll see you hopefully on Saturday when we welcome former poet laureate of Louisiana, another Kane. I can't remember her name now. Oh, she's not a Kane anyway, so you have to call it.
Not a Kane.
Have to tune in. Francis, you know it's your kin, right? Well, we go on here now. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Just close this up now.